Welcome back. The Environics Institute Survey of Muslims in Canada 2016 was released recently. The survey's results have been widely discussed in mainstream Canadian news media. What can we learn about Canadian Muslims from the results of the survey? Will the survey succeed in challenging stereotypes about Muslims? Joining me to discuss this is Aziza Kanji, lawyer and writer. Welcome to the show, Aziza.
Thank you for having me.
So the Survey of Muslims in Canada 2016 has garnered quite a lot of media attention over the past couple of weeks. Now, were you expecting this kind of a response?
I'm not surprised by the response. I think that people in Canada and in North America in general and in Europe are very curious about the Muslims among us. Are they loyal to the state? Do they have values that are significantly different from ours? Are they stealthily trying to impose Sharia law on everyone? And so I'm not surprised that the study got the level of media attention that it did. But I think that our challenge as Muslims is to think critically about the way that the media takes up the questions of Muslims. What aspects of Muslim experience in Canada are they focusing on? Are they focusing on whether Muslims are actually loyal and proud Canadians, how they see their Muslim identity in tension with their Canadian identity? I think that those kinds of concerns reflect deeper problematic ways of the ways that Muslims have been represented in Canadian society as potentially a fifth column, as potentially a disloyal or unpatriotic faction. And so I think that the media attention itself and the concerns that have been dominant in that media attention really reflect some deeper problematic dynamics with the way that Muslims have been represented in conversations around Canadian citizenship.
Yeah, but with all the media attention too, it sort of helped give Muslims an opportunity to speak out for ourselves and what we represent. And I know there were some very promising, and hopeful results about the Canadian Muslim population from the survey. So can you comment a little bit on that?
So one statistic that I think is particularly valuable in challenging some dominant assumptions about the Muslim community in Canada is that only 3% of Muslims have ever seen or heard violent extremism being promoted in a mosque in Canada. And I think that this is a very important statistic for us to be talking about, particularly because under the last government with Stephen Harper, mosques were really being represented as hotbeds of radicalization and as sites where violence were being promoted. And so this statistic that only 3% of Muslims have ever seen or heard violent extremism being promoted in a mosque in Canada really challenges this dominant representation as mosques and Muslim community spaces as hotspots where violence and terrorism is being fomented.
Well, it also brings back memories of, I remember the comment that Stephen Harper made about mosques being areas of that. And now when you see this kind of a statistic, which is very representative of the Muslim community, it sort of really helps, I think, the broader community stop and actually question, is this really the case that's happening? And now one other statistic that I wanted to focus on is in the report it said that young Muslims said that they, they do feel discriminated. 1 in 5, I think, or sorry, 1 in 3 mentioned that over the last 5 years, they did feel that they were discriminated against more. And then what's also interesting is this was a young group, so between 18 to 34, and at the same time, it's this very group that's becoming, more religious, more practicing, wearing the headscarf for women. So when we think about these 2 points together, isn't it, I guess, what's the correlation from your end? Because it seems a little bit like if you're being discriminated against, you would want to do less to stand out more, but what's happening here is we're seeing the opposite. So why do you think, why do you think that's happening?
So I'm not surprised, again, by either of those statistics. I think that young Muslims' experience with discrimination is predictable, sadly predictable, given the way that particularly young Muslim men have been represented as security threats in reports by government security agencies, by CSIS, RCMP, and Public Safety Canada, as well as in mainstream media narratives, which represent particularly young Muslim men as being in great danger of radicalizing to violent extremism, even though we don't really know how many of them are actually particularly prone to engage in violence. The security agencies are always very vague about giving actual numbers or statistics, and they just leave it to the power of imagination to suggest that there actually is this huge problem in the Muslim community. And this kind of narrative about young Muslims and young Muslim men in particular, first of all, it really serves to cast a pall of suspicion on young Muslim men as a whole, to represent them as a potential danger to Canada. And secondly, I think it also really serves to alienate Muslims from Canadian identity, because the highest levels of government are consistently representing Muslims as in some way standing outside what it means to be Canadian, or to have a Canadian identity. But then on the other hand, I think that young Muslims' increased expressions of religiosity then makes sense as an exercise in reclaiming a Muslim identity that has been stigmatized and that has been demonized. And to say that even though these very powerful narratives have been representing Islam as a threat or something dangerous, there was one CSIS report I was reading, for example, which talked about Islam and violent Islamism almost as a virus that spread from Muslim to Muslim. It said that radicalization can occur between husbands and wives, and wives and husbands, and parents are radicalizing their children, and radicalization is occurring pretty much anywhere these people are gathering, right? And so when you have these kinds of representations of Islam, which to us is something that's so beautiful, and that's a source of inspiration for how to live gently and justly in this world, when you have it being represented by government agencies as something that's like a malignant virus, I think it's a very understandable response to that, to say, no, I'm not going to acquiesce to this demand that you're placing on me to disavow my Muslim identity, but rather I'm going to claim it as something that has a place in this country, and that is in fact a source of inspiration for me to struggle to make this country better, and to ameliorate its structures of injustice and oppression.
This is excellent, especially the point that you talked about, the importance of reclaiming the faith. And one other statistic that I want to talk about is in the report, it said that Canadians, the Canadian Muslims said that they're proud to be Canadians, but they also feel a little bit more stronger in their Muslim identity. So how do we, in light of what you said, how do we understand that? Is it that, are you a Canadian and then a Muslim, or a Muslim and a Canadian? Like, how do we understand that statistic?
First of all, I think that the question is perhaps a little misleading, because it's based on a false dichotomy between being Muslim and being a Canadian. And I think for many Muslims in Canada, that's not the way that they experience their identity. I don't think it would even occur to many Muslim Canadians to think about ranking which identity is more important to them. So I think that the question itself is perhaps based on a false dichotomy. But I also think we need to think critically about this pressure that's always being placed on Muslim Canadians to proclaim themselves proud and to proclaim themselves almost hyper-patriotic in an environment where Muslims' loyalty to the country is always under suspicion. And so I think instead of, as a community, working to a place where we're simply proud to be Canadian, I think the real sign of security, of belonging, is the ability to be critical of the country that we're in, not just to be proud of it. We've seen recently in Toronto several examples of the types of systemic structures of injustice that are present in this country, with the response by Black Lives Matter Toronto, for example, to systemic anti-Black racism in policing and in society in general, with the occupation of the Indian and Northern Affairs Canada offices in response to the suicide epidemics and states of emergency that are rampant across Indigenous communities across this land. And so I think that in response to these signs of the deep injustices that are ingrained in this country, I think that perhaps our response as Muslim Canadians isn't simply to say that, yes, we're proud of being Canadian and we're not dangerous to you, we're not a threat, but to think about how we draw on Islam to participate in these struggles for justice, which are working to transform Canada in reality into what it's supposed to be on paper.
Which is, I think, why you and I are here as well, as speaking out and, helping dispel some of those stereotypes. So as we wrap up, I guess my final question for you is, how do you think this studies or surveys like these are helping paint a positive image of Canadian Muslims?
So pieces of data in the survey are certainly very important in challenging these dominant narratives that are constantly being perpetuated about the Muslim community. So, for example, I cited the statistic earlier about only 3% of Muslims having seen or heard violent extremism being promoted in the community. So in the short term, the data provided by the survey is important for us as advocates in challenging these dominant narratives. But I think in the longer term, we have to work to get to a place where a survey like this one wouldn't be necessary, where we wouldn't need a survey to tell people, no, Muslims aren't supporting violent extremism, no, Muslims aren't dangerous, no, Muslims aren't necessarily as patriarchal and misogynistic as everyone thinks they are. I think that that would really be the sign that we're being effective in tackling Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism in the country, which is that we don't need a survey to prove that Muslims are innocent.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts on the survey, Aziza. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.